Shabbat Shalom, everyone. My dear colleagues and I are taping with David Beckman. Thank you, David, in the Rabbi Samuel Chill Sanctuary on Wednesday, December the 11th. And our clergy conversation is going to roll out on Shabbat, December 14th. Dear colleagues, we have two storms to unpack. One is a storm in the world, the storm in the news, and the second is the storm in our weekly Torah portion, which so hauntingly, it's this Parshat HaShavua, frames in so many ways the event of the world, obviously talking about the murder in broad daylight and cold blood from the back of a 50-something-year-old executive, Brian Thompson of United Healthcare, premeditated murder, broad daylight, New York City, and the resultant reaction of hundreds of thousands of Americans cheering this murder, celebrating him not as a murderer but as a folk hero. Social media outlets trying to raise money for him, GoFundMe sources, free him is the hashtag, etc., trying to understand that. And we also have so you have a case of ugliness and nastiness that is just on steroids. And then you have ugliness and nastiness on steroids, Genesis 34, which is the rape of Dinah, the guile and deceit of Simon and Levi, and the wanton and reckless violence and mayhem that the other brothers do as well, and the horrifying reaction of Jacob to it all. Just two stories that couldn't get any worse, and they do. And they're at the same time, and we have to figure out at the end, is there a way out of this hot mess? And I think there is. So let's thank God for the gift of learning Torah together.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah, v'ha'arevna Adonai Eloheinu et divrei Toratcha b'finu u'b'fi amcha beit Yisrael, v'niyeh anachnu letzatzaenu letzatzai amcha beit Yisrael, kulanu yodei shemecha v'lomdei Toratecha lishma. Baruch atah Adonai hamelamed Torah le'amo Yisrael. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai notein Torah.
So colleagues, the root wrap for our lesson today, for our conversation, is we'll talk about the murder of Brian Thompson and how it went down in America, was received in America. We'll unpack that, then we'll look at the rape of Dinah and the revenge of the children of Jacob and Jacob's reaction after that, and then finally we'll look at the way out of it, which comes from the Torah. But first, before getting your reactions on the murder of Brian Thompson, I wanted to offer two lenses as a frame as I've been marinating on this. One comes from this book, Lost and Found, by Catherine Schultz, and it's about the power of and, how opposite truths can both be true, how A and the opposite of A can both be true. This is quoting from her book on page 194. Life is a perpetual and machine, reliably delivering us a mixture of things to experience all at once. It's perfectly possible to be charmed by your 9-year-old and infuriated by your 12-year-old and worried about an upcoming job interview and also worried about global climate change, etc. And then she ends by quoting, "We know that, as Philip Roth once put it, life is and." He meant that we do not live in a world of either or. We live with both at once, with many things at once. Everything connected to its opposite. Everything connected to everything. That's so I want to think about the power of and in both of these. And then the second is a point that I am indebted to our own member, Michael Gardner, who has been talking about this for a while, and nothing screams the truth of this more than the murder of Brian Thompson. Michael is always fond of saying that it's all about power of narratives. That narratives are much more powerful than facts. Facts are dry and inconsequential. The narrative sweep is what gives facts power, and it's the narrative sweep that inclines us to hold onto and pay heed to certain facts and utterly to ignore other facts because it just doesn't fit into our narrative sweep. And that is, of course, the case with October 7th. That is, of course, the case with the presidential election. The facts you choose to say, oh, that's a significant fact, is if it fits into your narrative. and the fact that you just pay no heed to is the fact that does not fit into your narrative. So the power of and, the power of narratives, and with that, dear colleagues, before we get into the texts about the murder and the Facebook posts, etc., some initial reactions, how you're processing both the murder of the CEO of healthcare, United Healthcare, and also the celebration by hundreds of thousands of Americans of the man who murdered him.
One of the things I was thinking about is, there was a movement. One of the other insurance companies was going to start changing a policy, a significant policy about.
Are you talking about Blue Cross Blue Shield and their anesthesia policy?
And then they, after this murder, they reneged on the change of that policy. So that actually was very frightening to me, because that seems to say that that the companies are giving into terrorism in a certain way. In other words, somebody else could just say, we don't like this policy. We're going to go after somebody that's an executive at Blue Cross Blue Shield, for example, unless they change or renege on their policy. So that's actually a little bit scary. I mean, the whole thing is scary. Just get up at 6:45 to get a cup of coffee. And walk down the street in Manhattan. I mean, that's just it's so frightening. It's so frightening. And I just, on a personal note, Emma was at a healthcare conference in Manhattan on that day, and I hear this news and I'm frightened to death. Aside from everything else, frightened to death. For other people in the area, and especially my family.
To me, what stands out in the whole thing is, regardless of, if he's considered a hero or not, or, and the problems that the healthcare present, is the obsession we have in this country with guns. That is what stands out, and nobody's talking about that. Everybody's talking, did he do the right way, the right thing? Is he a hero? He's not. He should be in jail. But, this idea that a kid that goes to UPenn can easily get a firearm and shoot whoever he wants. It's really scary. Yeah. Really scary.
By the way, there has been a lot of coverage, which I've seen myself, about this gun was made by a 3D printer. It's called a ghost gun. And the whole point of it is it's not traceable. And anybody can do it who has the know-how and the equipment. So it's violence and murder that is untraceable and universally available for the people who have the know-how. Michelle, Eliza, what are some initial takes of yours to this tragedy?
So I think for me especially, there was quite a bit of time between the murder and the arrest. And I just kept thinking about the desperation and the reality in our country that so many people are in desperate medical straits and desperate financial straits and don't see pathways to remedy that are legal or productive or helpful. And that, here's this young man, and his is a story of clear mental illness and clear physical illness. And it's not, of course, you cannot murder. Murder is wrong every way you look at it. And I think in these celebrations, I just see a real desperation.
Yeah, so can we just double click on that before we get to your voice, Michelle, on both of those? First of all, when you first read that Brian Thompson was murdered and shot in the back, you're just, that's murder and that's outrageous. And then that's one narrative, that murder bad, period, end of story, and that's true. And then you listen to the daily from yesterday of the people who cheered the murder, and they all have a story where their loved one, my son had leukemia and needed a transport to the hospital, but United Healthcare wouldn't approve it. My son died. My mother was sick and dying, and she needed some medical intervention, and United Healthcare wouldn't provide it. My mother is dead. My son is dead. And in all these cases, this was the daily from yesterday, that is December the 10th, they point out that by definition, Brian Thompson and by definition United Healthcare and by definition all medical insurance companies are dealing with the public when they are at their lowest point, when they're sick, when they're ill, when they're worried, and when they're dying. And then when they say no to somebody whose kid is dying, to somebody whose mother is dying, and then their profits soar, and they've got private planes, and they've got private jets, and they've got, bigger and bigger house, and a vacation house, and a this and a that, and I have a dead son because the insurance company said no. Like, what does that do to your neshama? What does that do to your vertigo? Like, murder wrong, we can accept that. And then what do you do with that testimony, Aliza?
Well, and there's no place for people to go, right? So what's the recourse that people have in those desperate moments? They don't have the time to go back and argue with the insurance company. They don't have, and they can't fix it.
Right.
And we have not set up pathways in this country, have not set up structures that enable justice. We're not organizing ourselves to provide healthcare to everyone. We are organizing ourselves to deprive people of human rights and dignity and healthcare, and that's super problematic. And there's not, I don't see out of this, right, this certainly doesn't solve it.
Right.
But I understand, and we have also, I think it's important to mention that Luigi, who is accused of this murder,
Right.
Himself suffered from serious chronic pain.
Right.
That is debilitating and which affects mental health and which seems to have contributed to his desperation in this moment.
Yeah. So we just talk about that. I mean, in other words, the suspected killer came from super rich family. His family, we all know this, his family owned this golf course in Maryland. His family owned that golf course in Maryland. His family owned, old age homes and healthcare centers in Maryland. He went to a fancy prep school in Maryland. He was the valedictorian. He went to Penn, and then he drops out of contact for 6 months. How do you process both the fact that he came from such, to use the word that our kids use, I don't love this word, but it's the word that our kids use, privilege. He came from such privilege, economic, educational, etc. And then also the obvious physical illness with his back and the obvious mental illness that he dropped out of touch. How does that all factor into how you understand this?
Michelle, can we hear your voice as well?
Well, we're coming. We're just unpacking Elisa's 2 points, and then I'm coming to...
I think it's also, it bears mentioning that I think there was a time in our country, in our world, where money could buy you better access to healthcare, and a point that I've seen made in many articles is that overall access is just decreasing across the board, whether or not you have resources. And I think it's a real sad case of, here is someone who is clearly suffering, and we missed them. We as a community missed supporting him, and he drops off out of contact for 6 months, and his family is trying to find him, and his family is trying to get to him, and we didn't.
My friend.
This conversation is just sickening to me because I don't think there is an end. There's just not an end. Somebody was murdered.
An or an and?
An and. There's not an and. A-N-D. Somebody was murdered. Full stop. There you go. There are also societal issues. That's a separate conversation.
But Michelle, let me ask you this. Okay, let me just gently push back. Obviously, I won't push back on the fact that he was murdered, full stop, okay? But on the fact that there's no and. So, I mean, the fact is there are a ton of Americans who write things like, Brian Thompson has more bodies to his name. Let Luigi go free. He did nothing wrong. This lad is a hero. And then, I mean, this is a voice. So my question is, how we understand this voice and what do we do with this voice? I didn't make up this voice. I didn't write it. I'm just reading it, right? This is written on Facebook by a woman named Alicia Gale. I mean, when CEOs are getting $5 million in bonuses, while people are dying because insurance keeps denying care for people, including my father, who died from cancer because they wouldn't cover a PET scan to find it earlier, I understand why the person did it. The people are tired of being seen as money machines, while the rich get richer and the poor die. So here's my question, Michelle. Obviously, all 5 of us are aligned that murder is bad and the suspected killer should face justice, etc. What would you say to Alicia Gale, whose father died from cancer because they wouldn't cover a PET scan? What do you say to her? And there's a ton of people like that.
I would have a question for her about the thought that murder is her answer out of that.
I disagree with you, Michelle. I think we can easily
Can you speak louder, Lice?
Yes, I disagree with you. I think we can have easily a conversation trying to convince that person that the pain shouldn't be, translated into killing, should be, allocating all the resources to put those people in jail, but not to kill. So, right. So there is an end.
Okay. So let's just pause for a second. So we're going to pivot to the Torah, and I want to do a close text reading of the rape of Dinah. But where you're at here is, if you zoom out of this story, you have ugliness that begets ugliness that begets ugliness that begets more ugliness that begets more ugliness. So you have all these patients who get denied the PET scan or the intervention or the ambulance treatment that would save their lives. I mean, that's the testimony of Americans. We have to willfully ignore it or willfully be blind to it to not see it. You just listen to the daily from December 10th. Is my son died, my mother died testimony. And these are insurance patients of United Healthcare, okay? So that denial, and then the burying your 6-year-old or burying your mother because of the denial, that's a lot of negative energy. And then you have this guy who has some kind of mental illness and physical illness who kills Brian Thompson in midday. Obviously, murder, he's got to face justice and whatever the justice system metes out. And then you have the further negative energy of all the people celebrating him as a hero. And then you have the further negative energy, invidious comparisons that were like the Gilded Age, that was the New York Times article, the rich, screw the rich, the poor, etc. And so it's just a negative energy fest. And the question I want to pose is, how do we get out of it? So let's take a look at the rape of Dinah, because I think the Torah is going to give us a way out of negative energy fest. Michelle, would you read on page 12 and 13 of the handout? We will read this slowly as Shai held taught us to make our way through this really hard story. Now, Dinah, page 12.
Now Dinah, the daughter whom Leah had borne to Jacob, went out visiting the daughters of the land. Shechem, the son of Hamor, the Hivite, chief of the country, saw her and took her and lay with her by force. Being strongly drawn to Dinah, daughter of Jacob, and in love with the maiden, he spoke to the maiden tenderly. So Shechem said to his father Hamor, "Get me this girl as a wife."
So I want to just offer a read of this, which I really, I've read this story for years. I really understand it at a deeper level only from Catherine Schultz's book, which is, if you look at verse 2 of the story, verse 2 cries out rape. And that's rape in Hebrew and rape in English. It's Vayikach otah, he takes her. Vayishkav otah, he lay with her. Vaya'aneha, he torments her, he afflicts her, he rapes her, he forces her, right? And in each case, he is the actor. She is the victim. She's a passive recipient. There's nothing here consensual. He is the actor, and the subject, she is the object. And the verbs are he take, he lay, he force her, okay? Then verse 3, va, which is Stephen Geller from the seminary taught me about the vav that is conjunctive, and the same way that we all say and, right? You just said and vatidbak nafsho bedina, his soul clinged to her. Devek is glue in modern Hebrew. Devekut is clinging in Hasidut. His soul clinged to her. Vaye'ehav et hana'ara, he loved her. Vayedaber al lev hana'ara, and he spoke tenderly to her. And then he wants to marry her. Kach li et hayalda hazot leisha, I want to marry her. So, colleagues, how do you make sense of this very uncomfortable and rape in verse 2? Deep falling in love in verse 3, I want to marry you in verse 4. How do you make sense of that?
It's interesting to me. Right now, I'm studying Masechet Ketuvot, and women are so often the object of intimacy, the object of marriage, the object of divorce. And so as I'm reading this language now, seeing her as the object to me doesn't feel as violent as it has in the past.
Are you just inured to objectification?
I don't think I'm inured to objectification. I think that we're reading male-based texts that see women as objects, and that here's this person who initially takes an opportunity and overcomes her, and then discovers that he likes her. And I'm not sure, like, what's the universe in which their paths would have crossed otherwise. Like, there's not a space or a place where they could hang out at a bar and meet up and have it strike up a connection. That's just not a thing. And not justify. I wanted to be clear. I'm not justifying it. It's an interesting, Anita Diamond's read of this is that it's romance. It's not rape, which is a lovely gloss over. It's a really interesting. I don't know of another case where you have this like intensive, intimate, forceful interaction that's followed by this passionate love. And we don't see a lot of passionate love in this way. Certainly these words are not used in other stories that I'm aware of where someone has an interaction then suddenly is speaking tenderly and falling in love and their souls are stuck together. That language doesn't happen even with our ancestors.
So we have to really mention that it's not me, but in this text there is a comment here that criticizes the behavior of Dinah, right? That basically says something about promiscuous conduct. Okay, it's on page 12. It's the ravishing of Dinah, all right? And it not only says that some medieval, but also some modern commentators, in a way, are saying something different, are blaming her. So it's the Shivim Panim La Torah.
Well, whatever.
And I don't say this, okay? It's what it says in the text.
Why did you bring this unlovely comment?
Because it's here, and we have to mention it as well.
Okay.
Okay?
So wait, just to follow up on that, your point is that
No, it's not my point, it's what is in the text.
No,
the
but
text
when
point that
bring
you wanted
it,
to bring
when
is
you
cannot-
that
bring it,
because
you
we
own
can-
it.
because
You
we
bring
cannot
you own
ignore
It's
it.
like you bring
Why
it, you own it.
does the
But-
commentator write this?
if the commentator writes it, what's the point? The point is that she should not have been out, and because she was out, this man took her and then fell in love with her. Because she was out, she was raped, and therefore, if women didn't
What
go
they are
out,
saying is that it was an unusual behavior for the time.
Elias, it's obviously patriarchal pig-headedness. It's patriarchal pig-headedness. It's an embarrassment and abomination.
I didn't write this. So
Okay.
you
No,
are
but
you
I-
are calling the
I wanna-
pig-headed the people who wrote this?
I want to come
Absolutely.
back. So
Absolutely.
would you say that Brian Thompson shouldn't have been out without a security detail? That
What
he-
does it have to do with this?
That,
because
how do you
that's
blame
the
the victim?
equivalent situation in a situation where should he not have been in New York without a security detail, and by going out with his position and with the work that he was doing, was he being,
Could it be that the story is not the real story and the story is that they really fell in love and there was no rape?
Well, okay. So thank you for that intervention. Michelle, what's your take on this so far?
I'm going to be very interested to see where you make the connection.
Oh, let's keep reading. Verse 5. Keep going.
Jacob heard that he had defiled his daughter Dinah, but since his sons were in the field with his cattle, Jacob kept silent until they came home. Then Shechem's father Hamor came out to Jacob to speak to him. Meanwhile, Jacob's sons, having heard the news, came in from the field. The men were distressed and very angry because he had committed as an outrage in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter, a thing not to be done.
Keep going.
And Hamor spoke with them, saying, My son Shechem longs for your daughter. Please give her to him in marriage. Intermarry with us. Give your daughters to us, and take our daughters for yourselves. You will dwell among us, and the land will be open before you. Settle, move about, and acquire holdings in it. Then Shechem said to her father and her brothers, Do me this favor, and I will pay whatever you tell me. Ask of me a bride price ever so high, as well as gifts, and I will pay what you tell me. Only give me the maiden for a wife. Jacob's sons answered Shechem and his father Hamor, speaking with guile, because he had defiled their sister Dinah, and said to them, We cannot do this thing to give our sister to a man who is uncircumcised, for that is a disgrace among us. Only on this condition will we agree with you, that you will become like us, in that every male among you is circumcised. Then we will give our daughters to you and take your daughters to ourselves, and we will dwell among you and become as one kindred. But if you will not listen to us and become circumcised, we will take our daughter and go.
So, and then we know the rest of the story is that Shechem is so besotted with love, he tells his and he's a mover shaker in this community, and he gets them all to be circumcised. Okay, and why don't we just finish the story, which is on page 16, on the so all these men who in Hamor and Shechem and in the community get circumcised. Verse 25, on the third day.
On the third day, when they were in pain, Shimon and Levi, two of Jacob's sons, brothers of Dinah, took each his sword and came upon the city unmolested and slew all the males. They put Hamor and his son Shechem to the sword and took Dinah out of Shechem's house and went away. And the other sons of Jacob came upon the slain and plundered the town, because their sister had been defiled. They seized their flocks and herds, and all that was inside the town and outside, all their wealth, all their children, all their wives, all that was in the houses, they took as captives and booties.
Right. So one of the things that I want to just pause for a second here is, you note that the moral equities all of a sudden in the story get very complicated. It's no longer simple, right? Dinah, of course, I mean, the pshat is she's just a victim, and you have nothing but sympathy for Dinah. But Shechem is a rapist who then is besotted and falls in love and wants to marry her, and uses his suasion in the town and does this crazy thing where he circumcises himself and his father circumcises, and he gets everybody circumcised because all he wants now is to marry her. So it's a complicated moral picture, because he's a rapist, and he's a besotted in love rapist, and he wants to get married and build a life of love. That's just a lot of complexity and a lot of layers. And then the whole Jacob story, on first his family is the victim, his daughter gets raped, then they are deceitful and they are guileful. That's the Torah's only bemirma. And then what's really interesting, and this is one of the many connections to this story of the murder of Brian Thompson, is how violence begets more violence, ugliness begets more ugliness, nastiness begets more nastiness. I mean, think about October 7th and the war 14 months later, right? Violence begets more violence, nastiness, more nastiness, murder, more murder, etc., etc. And then think about, and the language here is, so they rape Dinah, so that's the violation of one person, and then they kill all the males. And then if you look at this word, at this text that Michelle just read closely, the leitmotif is the word kol. Ve'et kol chelam, ve'et kol tapam, ve'et neshehem shavu, ve'yavosu, ve'et kol asher babayit. In one verse, all their wealth, all their children, all that was in the house, they took as captives and booty. They kill all the males. They imprison all of the women and all the children, and they steal all the stuff, just like a swirling, increasing storm of ugliness and nastiness that flowed from that first violation. Okay, then comes just the end, and then we'll unpack this. Verse 30, Jacob said to Simeon and Levi.
Jacob said to Shimon and Levi, "You have brought trouble on me, making me odious among the inhabitants of the land. The Canaanites and the Perizzites, my men are few in number, so that if they unite against me and attack me, I and my house will be destroyed." But they answered, "Should our sister be treated like a whore?"
Yeah, so this is it's such an odious end and such an unsavory end, but I think so real. And another point of connection, both to October 7th, which is not our conversation today, but also to Brian Thompson's murder, which is, it's all about me, right? Jacob can't see he has no moral voice. He has no moral vision here. It's, you're going to make it tough for me among the inhabitants of Canaan because of what you did. He doesn't say, how could you do this? How could you murder all these people? Where you've become the enemy, you've become like them. Yeah, how could you steal all their stuff? How could you kidnap? How could you enslave? What's wrong with you? Is this how I raised you? No, there's no moral voice and there's no moral vision. There's, what does this mean to me? And when you think about the hundreds of thousands of social media posts, when you think about the people whose hashtag is free this murderer, when you think about the GoFundMe pages trying to raise money for his defense, what they're saying is, what about me? My son died because of Brian Thompson. My mother died because of Brian Thompson. And so I find this story, the swirling, ever increasing violence, and the focus on me, and the lack of a moral. Like the people who wrote the social media posts must know that murder is wrong. They must know what you know. They must know what we know, but they can't articulate that vision because my son died because of Brian Thompson, and that's Jacob's voice here. So, what do you guys? What comes up for you when you read this story in this week?
I just want to come back to that. They know murder is wrong, but there's also a reality in the world where there's no justice for the deaths that insurance companies' negligence has called. There's no moral justice there, and so that feels like it's an important thing to note. If there were pathways, if there are places for people to get justice, would that change people's reactions now? Would people have the moral compass to be able to say murder is wrong, full stop? Is it that people feel powerless and feel like there's no avenue for change, and they have no power and they have no recourse, and that changes the game? And in this story too, there's no higher authority of humans that they can appeal to. It's vigilante justice because there's not like a police force, there's not like a government, there's not who can they brothers go to for justice. And I think that's the place where I'm noting the similarity is that we want to live in a world where we have a group of elders, a group of wise people, a group of officers and officials who create justice and pathways of justice. And in the absence of that, I think we nurture a society of vigilante justice and violence.
So you're justifying the killing?
Not justifying the killing, being aware that it's so important for us to have legal and moral pathways to find justice in order for people not to react this way.
I mean, what I want to just honor from your words, and again, when I read the story, I was appalled by the murder and appalled by the reaction. But what I now, in terms of the spirit of Catherine Schultz's is, if your son dies at 6 because Brian Thompson's company won't allow a treatment, and now you have a dead son, where do you go with that? What do you do with that? That is and I think your comment is bringing that up, right? What do you do with that? Where do you go with that? My son died. Not to mention my mother died. I mean, those are all the testimonies. Where do you go with that? And there is no legitimate way to treat that anger. There's no way to get recourse for that anger, and therefore it's just you have a bollock stop anger and And I think that is. I really appreciate that point. I'm not speaking for you. I'm not justifying that anger or saying it makes murder appropriate. Obviously, it doesn't. But I think it is good to point out just the complexity, the narrative, and the and of it all, that there is some unresolved, deep aggrievement that needs a voice and needs a more healthy outlet.
I think the one thing that Elise has been saying the one thing that this country does not have is a system for us to be able to process this. We do have a legal system. Someone murders someone, they're caught, they'll go to trial, but we don't have a system, as you pointed out, that helps us in the recourse of trying this country, the healthcare system in this country is broken, and I don't know that it's repairable in our lifetime.
I think also there are great structures for insurance companies and business conglomerates to protect their power and to protect their wealth, and there are not the same structures to help poor people who are adversely affected by their policies to fight justice and to change policy. And I appreciate that you brought up the Blue Cross Blue Shield policy around anesthesia. I think that's a really important policy that we should all be thinking about. Their initiative, it seemed like, was to limit the number of total hours of anesthesia allowed for any given procedure, and people were concerned, what does that mean for my procedure if my surgery goes over because of any number of situations that could arise in the operating room? Does that mean they're going to cut off anesthesia? And who decides, and at what point in the surgery does that mean that they would have to stop the surgery halfway through and then go and request additional anesthesia coverage? And in that case, public outcry even before this, they had already recalled the decision, and they said that we misunderstood. But I think that the idea that it requires that kind of public outcry, the idea that insurance companies are making these decisions and the only recourse
they
that we
might have done
have,
it.
that they might have done it,
Right.
and
It's
that
like,
that's
it's like
insanity.
the near killing of Al-Qaeda that causes Sarah's death. Like, what? You mean Abraham had the knife to his throat? Oh my God, it almost came that close. Oh my God, and she died? And that's like that. Oh my God.
It was just a test. We just wanted to
Right.
see if you were paying attention.
Yeah. I want to, Michelle, did you have any voice you wanted to offer on the Dinah story before we pivot from the Dinah story?
I think that instinct of, should our sister be treated like, all of this is justified because there's some breach in the universe, is a voice that is just so clearly condemned in the end of the story. No, it's not. Your actions are not justified by the fact that there was this defilement of your sister. There are other ways, there are other avenues, and our Torah at least demands that we reach to find them.
Okay, so thank you. So that is going to get us. I most often, as you all know, don't have a happy ever-ending uplift. But I think in this case, there is a very beautiful piece of uplift from the Torah. Very beautiful piece of uplift. So the end of Genesis, Parshat Vayechi, which is Steve Grossman's bar mitzvah portion, and Steve it's always in December when nobody's in town, and Steve comes and does the Haftorah for the last 50 years. Vayechi is Jacob on his deathbed blessing the tribes of Israel. That's the last chapter of Genesis. And the last chapter of Deuteronomy, V'zot HaBracha, is Moses doing the same thing. And there is a lot of meaning to be made when you compare the two. So first, Aliza, would you read on page 18? This is Jacob's blessing, in quotation marks, to Shimon and Levi. Page 18.
Shimon and Levi are a pair. Their weapons are tools of lawlessness. Let not my person be included in their council. Let not my being be counted in their assembly. For when angry they slay men, and when pleased they maim oxen. Cursed be their anger so fierce and their wrath so relentless. I will divide them in Jacob, scatter them in Israel.
Yeah. So there's so much about this that's so powerful. We could have a whole separate class just on this point. That in the moment when his daughter is raped and his kids take their revenge, in the moment, Jacob does not have a moral voice. All he can think about is, oh my God, you've made it bad for me, for us. But with the passage of time, he has a moral voice. This was wrong. And what that could mean, for Israel and the Jewish people and the ongoing war 14 months later is a whole separate conversation. In the immediate aftermath of October 7th, how do you see it? 14 months later, how do you see it? How does the passage of time change our moral awareness? That's, I think, a whole separate conversation here. But in this case, Jacob can't see a moral dimension in the moment, but years later he can, and he condemns both of them. Shimon and Levi are a pair. Shimon v'Levi achim. Klei chamas macherotehem. Their tools are violence. Okay. Now, let's just compare Moses, because it's so different in two material regards. So, Aliza, will you finish up with and of Levi? This is Moses' blessing.
And of Levi he said, Let your Tumim and Urim be with your faithful one, whom you tested at Massah, challenged at the waters of Meribah, who said of his father and mother, I consider them not. His brothers he disregarded, ignored his own children. Your precepts alone they observed, and kept your covenant. They shall teach your laws to Jacob, and your instructions to Israel. They shall offer you incense to savor and whole offerings on your altar. Bless, O Lord, his substance, and favor his undertakings. Smite the loins of his foes, let his enemies rise no more.
So this point is subtle, but it's just so important, and I want to end with this. In the story, it's Shimon and Levi, Shimon and Levi, Shimon and Levi. It's like peanut butter and jelly, peanut butter and jelly, peanut butter and jelly. They just go together, okay? And they do their deed in Genesis 34, peanut butter and jelly, Shimon and Levi. And then Jacob, when he's dying, also peanut butter and jelly, Shimon and Levi, Shimon and Levi, Shimon and Levi, and you're both accursed. I'm going to scatter you both. I have no use for either one of you. I have no use for either one of you. You're just violent. Your anger, yuck. I have no use for either one of you. Okay. Comes Moses, and he separates peanut butter and jelly. And he separates Shimon and Levi. And Levi, and there's a footnote from Rabbi Kushner, that Levi's zeal, which had been used in a bad way against Shechem, is used in a good way for the service of God. And so Levi, you're going to sublimate your energy in the service of God, and you're going to do Torah, and you're going to do mitzvah, and you're going to do ritual, and you're going to be in the, you're going to offer the sacrifices, you're going to offer the korbanot, you're going to be offering prayers and psalms and songs. You're going to help people process life, the good, the bad, the ugly, the guilty, the delightful. You are going to be clay kodesh, from clay Hamas to clay kodesh. You have agency, Levi, to change, and if you become a servant of the Lord and you do your work in the house of the Lord, you're going to have peace and blessing. That's Levi. Shimon is not blessed by Moses. Shimon disappears. So to me, the clear message is that violence has no future, that murder has no future, and that the end for violence and murder and anger that's is Shimon, scattered, dispersed, forgotten. He's literally like, I kept reading it, and then where's Shimon, where's Shimon, where's Shimon? And then I looked at the commentaries and say, oh, by the way, Shimon is not blessed by Moses. Like at the end of the Torah, there is no Shimon. He's just not blessed. But Levi changes up his game. So here's my message. The way out is Torah and mitzvah. Shabbat shalom.